The RTÉ Rugby Podcast, sponsored by Canterbury. See the new Irish men and women's rugby jerseys at canterbury.com.
All right, you're very welcome along to this week's RTÉ Rugby Podcast, heading into the final round of the Guinness Six Nations, Ireland against Scotland this Saturday afternoon. The middle game of Super Saturday, also got Wales, Italy and France, England as well. Donal, Lenihan and Bernard Jackman are with me this afternoon to chat through the win against England and the game against Scotland coming up this weekend. Guys, how are you doing?
Pretty good.
Yeah, good, thank you.
We probably won't dwell too long on the game itself against England because there's been plenty said about it over the last few days as well. But Donal, I might start with you first. Over the last couple of days, there was probably a bit of frustration for a lot of the game. There was probably a lot of discussion about how the performance itself wasn't that great in spite of a 4-try win against England. Over the last few days, has your kind of mind changed much at all? Have you been able to reflect differently on the match now that, you know, it's kind of soaked in a little bit more?
Yeah, I think I have. Look, it's difficult when you're in the commentary box and you're doing a game on television. You're so focused on the game itself. You're so sort of centered on trying to watch patterns, what's happening in the game. Sometimes you tend to lose the overall picture. My sense being in Twickenham, firstly, I think you had to be there to appreciate just what a cauldron it was. The English crowd obviously were incensed by the Charlie Ewels sending off. Now, it's one of the issues. They didn't show the replay on the television. I think they should, because anybody looking at it would have seen it was a red card immediately. But look, that's a debate for another day. Obviously, the England crowd got behind the team. England, that old belligerence came out. They went back to type. They played a very direct type of rugby. Their kicking game was excellent. Their kick chase superb. Their set piece outstanding. And they stressed Ireland in a lot of ways. When a team, there's games, even against inferior opposition, where you find yourself in a cauldron like that, and it can be quite difficult to dig your way out of it. So I think there was huge positives from Ireland in terms of being examined in a way that maybe in advance of the game they didn't think they would be. Certainly that third quarter, when England came back to 15-all, there was all kinds of questions asked of Ireland. But they found a way. They found a solution. They stuck to the way they wanted to play, and they got the rewards with the 2 tries at the end. In fact, I only watched a replay of the game there again early this morning, and I found it way more enjoyable this time, I have to say. So look, it was a test that I think will stand to Ireland for what's coming down the road. Twickenham is a very difficult place to go and win. England had only lost 2 Six Nations games in Twickenham in 10 years. We came away with a bonus point win. Yes, there were issues there. There were things highlighted. The scrum obviously was a major issue on the day, but it isn't as if our scrum is a problem. You do get, sometimes in a match, you come across something that you're not quite sure how to deal with. And I think there was an issue there as well. But I don't see that as a sort of a repeating theme. So from that point of view, and when you look at the stats, actually, of Ireland's performance, I think there was a huge amount that Ireland can take from the game. But most importantly, the fact that they came away with 5 points.
Yeah, and Birch, like one thing Donal said there at the start, is it the fact that things were going wrong for so long, but there was an awful lot of composure shown in that last quarter of the game where the experienced heads came out, like the likes of Conor Murray and those who were on the pitch, maybe Johnny Sexton as well, just slowed things down. They made it more direct and they picked themselves up, and they were actually very, very clinical in that last 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, they're really good. I think when, particularly when Marcus Smith made it 15-all, you know, that was a time, given what was starting to happen, that, players could go off track. And I actually thought that they got more clarity of thought for the last 20 minutes than they had for the second and third quarter. And there's some, big moments. So Andrew Conway's 2 50-22s, we had been overplaying a little bit. We had been a little bit anxious to keep ball in hand and try and stretch him, whereas, he just got us down there, and that field position was important. As you said, I thought the bench coming on, particularly Conor Murray, I thought, was made a big impact and just didn't make any errors and played to the right areas of the field. So I think I agree with Donal. I think Ireland will get massive positive. Like, it's so rare to, it's nearly impossible, to be honest. I know we had an extra man, but to concede 7 to be penalised 7 times between 6 penalties and a free kick at the scrum and still get women a bonus point. I mean, it's unheard of. So we got through that. I think we'll be smarter next time. I think the 2 matches in the Six Nations, our scrum has been under pressure, has been France and England, and both attacked us in a completely different way. So that's good for us to learn. And again, as Donal said, most weeks we won't get tested at scrum time. It's, in my opinion, it's only England, France, and South Africa who have the tools to really go after us. And I think that it's great to learn, but still win with maximum points.
On the scrum, we may as well get into it. Like, as you kind of hinted there, Donal, do you think it's like, is it not something to be worrying about long term? It's just one of those days where England identified something, they got on the right side of the referee, and in future games, that's not necessarily going to be happening.
No, I don't think it is. Look, we all know French referees, they tend to make their mind up early, who is the dominant scrum. And when you get that lip, when you know the referee is on your side, you can actually get away with things that you wouldn't try otherwise. Look, we all know Tyke Furlong is probably the best tight head in the world. England found a way of attacking him. Certainly Genge and George, the hooker, worked extremely well together. The disappointing thing for me, Bertrand, I'd be interested in your take on this. Halftime, I was expecting, some form of a solution, or certainly that given you 10, 15 minutes to talk it through. And I go back to, if you remember the Heineken Cup 2011, I can't remember, Birch, whether you were involved, Leinster and Northampton. Leinster scrum famously under severe pressure in the opening half of that game. I remember talk afterwards of Greg Feek with the iPad out, sitting down with Mike Ross. They found a solution there, and they turned the whole thing around in the second half. Leinster, I think, 16 points down, turned the game around and went on to a comprehensive victory. I was just a little disappointed, even in terms of getting a message to the referee, that Ireland weren't able to get either solve it in terms of their approach, or get a message to the referee to say, look, you've got to look at England, that Genge's backside is coming out. He wasn't scrummaging parallel to the touchline. So, that was disappointing from my perspective.
Yeah, I think I was retired in 2011, but I know what happened. The dressing room was apparently chaos, and Greg Feek felt he wouldn't get his message across, so he brought the pack into the showers, and he had an overhead, like that spider cam view we've seen of the Sinclair boring in that everyone is going mad about. But he had an overhead view, and he could see where Leinster were losing their connections, and apparently, the players saw from above. They were able to basically understand exactly what they needed to do in the second half. And if you remember, they went from having a weak scrum to a dominant scrum, and it was a big part of changing around. I think what happened at half time is that they basically they said, we're not going to crab it, we're not going to wheel around on the left hand side anymore, and if the pressure comes on, go to ground. But if you watch it back, so the scrums collapsed, and England's back 5 kept pushing. So actually the scrum collapsed on the mark of where the ball was put in, but England's back 5 just kept pushing. Very dangerous, actually, because the whole front rows were kind of over top of each other. But for the referee's point of view, and this is French refereeing, the team that can go forward can pretty much do what they want. And they managed to win more penalties then, whereas I'd say John Fogarty in Ireland were saying, look, go to ground. Let's make it a 50-50 in terms of the referee's decision. And very rarely, and you've seen this more than I have, but does a referee kind of stick with his initial instinct the whole way through? Normally, if you give away 4 penalties, you might get the next 2. It's just, it's particularly if it goes to ground. If you stay in the fight and you go backwards. So we couldn't. I think the tactic of not going backwards was right, but obviously we painted such a poor picture that, and the fact that it was a French referee, that it was it didn't turn around at all. But I do think we have a problem in terms of depth in our front 5, particularly on the loosehead side, behind Andrew Porter. And this is David Kilcoyne is a brilliant player. Cian Healy has been a brilliant player, but I wonder where the next loosehead is coming from. And also, I mean, Dan Sheehan is a phenomenal player, but I think at the moment his role is best suited to coming off the bench with 30 minutes to go when that scrum contest has evened out to a certain extent. And do we have can we find more set piece type players that, for example, at the weekend, Wales playing France, they brought in Thomas to play loosehead. he's played 8 caps for Wales, but he's seen now in Wales as being the best scrummaging loosehead. He's not the best rugby player in loosehead. Wyn Jones is still seen to be that. But Wayne Pivac felt, if I give Antonio an inch here, he'll take a mile. So they picked a set piece player, and they stayed in the game. They stayed in the game till the very end. So maybe that's what we need to try and do is to. No, look at it. It's not a panic by any means, but have more balance. So Kilcoyne for me and Porter are two, very very focused on what they bring, which is big power and big energy. Cian Healy was able to do both. I just wonder, is his power waning a little bit? And certainly we've seen some scrums for Leinster and for Ireland where he's got a really bad habit of kicking his hips out and allowing that tight into that space. And to be honest, what he can do for Leinster sometimes is let that tight into that space, and then he's so strong in comparison to the tight heads he plays against in the URC that he can pop them up and we win a penalty. But the problem was Sinclair was so far across, and he's not a bad scrummager. He's not brilliant. I agree with you, Donal. I think you're unlucky. You're unlucky in terms of saying that Genge and Sinclair aren't brilliant scrummagers, because I think sometimes they get exposed. Sinclair particularly, and Genge can get penalised off the field. So you were right. Just on the day, it just became a real collective effort. And Jamie George is phenomenally strong and phenomenally good in that area, and he kept the whole thing together.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt about that. I mean, the Lions initially didn't pick Sinclair to go on the tour. He only came in when Andrew Porter got injured in the end. So, but yourself, the scrum, it's all about the opening 15 minutes. Once you can show that you've parity there, it's not an issue, then the opposition stop taking you on. It's when they sense that they have a little bit of an advantage early on that they keep going for it. So that is an issue. It's not a problem that Ireland have had, but I agree 100% in terms of the next layer underneath Kilcoyne and Cian Healy. A year out from a World Cup, that is a concern. Obviously, we had cover on tight head when Andrew Porter was over there. His primary function now is as a starting loosehead, and we have to leave him there. There's talk that Ireland are looking for 2 games against the Maori in the summer to supplement the 3 tests. Now, 5 games in New Zealand, I think it's a brilliant opportunity. You can bring down a bigger squad of players. That is a proving ground down there. I mean, New Zealand had given up the scrum about 7 or 8 years ago, but then Cron had come in as the scrum coach in New Zealand. Graham Henry, I remember when he came back from Northern Hemisphere, it was almost as if New Zealand, they were so intent on playing this fast offloading game. They were playing back row forwards in the second row, and they lost their affinity with the set piece. It's only when they reintroduced themselves to the importance of that they began to dominate and win World Cups again. So I think the summer tour is going to be huge for Andy Farrell, trying to generate a bit of depth in that front row, because it's definitely a concern. Going to a World Cup, you need at least 5 props, if not 6. In fact, they've expanded. You can now bring 32 players, I think, in a World Cup squad. So you can actually have 3 sets of front rows. At the moment, Ireland's starting front rows are outstanding. The layer behind them are proven experienced guys like Kilcoyne and Cian Healy. It's the next layer underneath that, which we're going to have to find in the next year, because you only go back to the last World Cup. England, outstanding right throughout the tournament. Their performance against New Zealand in the semi-final was outstanding. Yet, Sinclair got injured, if you remember, in the first 5 minutes of the World Cup final. Dan Cole, a lot of people had felt was gone past it at that stage. He came on, and the England scrum was decimated by South Africa in the final. And in the end, that was the difference between winning and losing. So it still remains a key element to the game, even though you might have only known 8 or 9 scrums in a match.
Well, Birch, in terms of the personnel then, like if we're talking about that next layer on the loosehead side specifically, because that's kind of what we've been talking about, who are the candidates there, and what are their skill set? Like who's the best scrummager of the lot? Who's the most explosive? Jeremy Loughman seems to be the next cab off the rank at the moment. He was brought in there last week. But what's your own take on that? Who are the outstanding candidates going forward?
Well, look, it's going to be a very level playing field. So you see Dooley going to Connacht. So if he becomes first choice in Connacht, obviously Buckley will have something to say about that. But is he going to find an extra level? Ed Byrne is going to be realistically third choice in Leinster because Porter and Cian Healy are going to get the minutes there. Eric O'Sullivan, certainly, he's shown a lot of potential, but his form has dipped a little bit, and he's probably not that out-and-out scrummager. Lockman, Lockman is in the Irish squad now, but I haven't seen. To be honest, I'm really worried about it. I think if you think about it, if you say Kilcoyne and Healy, for 13 years, Porter was initially loosehead. So for 13 years, we haven't really produced another international loosehead, I would say, of that standing. And look, it's hard. It's very difficult to bring them through. But so I don't know. I don't think there's an obvious candidate out there to go and be able to lock horns with the best tight heads in the world.
Donal is a bit like out half, where there are plenty of contenders, but no one has quite kind of put their head above the parapet yet.
Yeah, I think that is a problem. I think it's also an issue in that some of the younger guys that Birch is alluding to, they're not regular first choice starters for their provincial teams. So you need somebody within the provinces outside of Leinster to grasp that loose head scenario and to drive on. I mean, there's a number there that Birch has spoken about, Eric O'Sullivan being one of them. Lockman is now definitely second in line to Dave Kilcoyne in Munster. But it's a huge step up to the next level. But it is something that obviously Andy Farrell is conscious of, John Fogarty, because the likes of O'Sullivan now, Lockman, Tom O'Toole on the right head side, on the tight head side, they've all been brought into Irish camp. So they're looking closely at these guys. They know who the candidates are. It's a question of those players getting as much exposure as possible. And you need that in Europe for me. I think, you're going over to France. I remember young Josh Wycherley was Munster's third choice loosehead, played against Clermont-Auvergne, if you remember, 2 years ago, up against Slimani. I mean, what an experience. That was worth 6 months of training in Limerick. First scrum, he goes skydiving, but he found a way back. And that is the key. You got to keep fighting. You got to keep learning. No, I think he hasn't had a huge amount of game time since. So he has a bit to go to get back to that level. But that's where you find out about these young players. And that's where the Heineken Cup, for me, has a huge role to play in terms of Andy Farrell and John Fogarty, Paul O'Connell, sifting out the next level that's behind the frontline players, because they're going to have to bring them to New Zealand. I really hope that Ireland get those 2 additional games against the New Zealand Maori, because I think in terms of, you'll then be 13, 14 months out from the World Cup. That's the best exposure you're going to get. And I think they could learn more down there in 3 or 4 weeks than they will in the whole season of URC matches, for example.
Moving from the scrum discipline to line-out discipline, it's been something of a recurring theme with Ireland over the last year, where almost every game there's one of these obstruction penalties at the line-out. And I know, Donal, you were voicing your opinion on it on Saturday afternoon when Ian Henderson gave away one of those penalties. We asked Ian Henderson about it yesterday on Ireland's media duty, about what happened. Is this a kind of a recurring issue for Ireland that they need to stamp out? Here's what he had to say.
When we look at we've reviewed our line-out, obviously, and in previous games it might be slightly different. Those all come from, be it a mislift or something doesn't function well beforehand. That's usually the issue with that. When you fold round the back, it's usually due to a previous error, which is probably frustrating on our part, because we want to get good drill, we want to get good tempo. That one there, like there's various things that you can point at, but personally myself, I just need to make sure I'm more disciplined in behind Bernie there as he's going up. Obviously, we had massive threat, which we'd seen earlier on in the game from Maro Toje coming through the seams, and when you've got someone like that, he's your main worry there. And when you try to take that space in the middle of the line out, he's not there, that's when it can show bad pictures to the referee. But yeah, I think that's something that when you hear about referees and their meetings, and you get a lot of feedback from the refs and they're hot on things, that's definitely something that we probably need to be aware of, that they're hot on at the minute.
Now, that was Ian Henderson there. Donal, before you give your opinion on it, can you explain as a kind of a line-out person, what is it for people maybe who don't fully understand that are listening at home? What is it that Ireland are doing? What are they trying to do? Why is it illegal?
Well, it's very simple in that basically you've a lifter on each side of the jumper. Basically, one of the lifters pivots himself in between the jumper who has caught the ball and the opposition before he comes to ground. That prevents the opposition from being able to tackle the person who has the ball. So it's a form of obstruction. You can't do that until the line-out is over. It's been a recurring theme. It cost Ireland a try against Wales, I think, in the start of the championship. When you get into those positions, 5 or 6 meters out from the opposition line, you've got to be absolutely clinical in terms of your execution. As Ian Henderson said there's no doubt that referees, this is something that Ireland have done in the past, so it's something that referees are looking out for. And referees are thrilled. They do their homework in advance. When they spot something that a team tries to get away with, they're really thrilled to be able to pick it up because it shows them in a good light. In fact, I only saw some of the highlights of Munster playing against the Bulls over the weekend. And again, they had a try disallowed. I think Jack O'Donoghue who had a try disallowed for the exact same offence. So obviously, it's a systems thing that Irish teams try to get away with. And let's be honest, in rugby, you try to get away with things as much as you can. If the referee doesn't pick it up, then you're going to do it again. To be fair to Henderson, I understand what he is saying in that Maro Itoje is such a pain in the backside when you get into those positions because he's the best in the world at finding a way to get himself in there when the team comes back into ground. And I think there was an element that Ireland had to seal that off early. But for me, it's just happening a little bit too often. And I think in the context of last Saturday's game, when there was a number of penalties given away, uncharacteristic penalties. Normally when Ireland get into that scoring zone, they're very clinical. But, they didn't help their own cause by those silly penalties. Henderson, again, I think gave away another penalty at the breakdown when the ball was out coming in with his hand. There was no way he was going to impact on the recycle of that ball in the first place. So you're better off letting it go. But look, I think given that it's been highlighted once again now and that they've spoken about it, I don't think it's going to be a problem this weekend. But it is frustrating when you see the same mistakes recurring time and time again.
Bernard, I've seen plenty of people in the last couple of days pointing out how Ulster actually do that a lot and have been scoring quite a few tries off, and it's why their maul is so effective. Is the big difference kind of what Donal was saying, that everyone is trying to push the boundaries of the law a little bit, but there's a subtle way of doing it and there's an obvious way of doing it.
Yeah, there's an obvious way of doing it. I think the problem is that if you get it done properly, if you double bank as such, right, so you get another body directly behind the catcher, it's effectively impossible for, well, obviously you have to get the next block in there as well, but it's impossible for someone like Itoje to get through the line out as such. That's what Ireland are trying to do. That's what everyone's trying to do. So effectively, you get it built properly legally, it effectively should be looking at a try. But obviously, when it goes wrong, and it's clear to the referee, it's a penalty. So it's a massive swing. But I remember, like O'Connell is a real technician, and I remember picking up early in his start as a forwards coach where Ireland actually pulled the player into that position on purpose, for the opposition, and
they pulled the Maro Itoje.
Yeah, no. So the guy, the Ian Henderson who's lifting Tyke Byrne. So Courtney Lawes lifting Maro Itoje. They actually pulled Courtney Lawes into that position and put him there, even though he didn't want to be there. And the referee gave a penalty. It wasn't against England; it was against someone else. But it's really smart. It was in that, they put the guy there on purpose. But now it's gone full circle where we've just got a little bit sloppy, and I'd say we're driving O'Connell mad, to be honest, because he's not just happy to win the ball. It's about quality of delivery, but also it's about not giving away penalties. So it's something I'd be shocked if it's not fixed. I think this week their drill will be much better.
In terms of Scotland, then this weekend, what are the big threats we've seen from Scotland so far? Because they've obviously been a bit hot and cold. Started off with that really great win against England, and it's just been a bit mixed since then. Scored some nice tries against Italy at the weekend, but let in a few bad ones as well. Do they have the weapons to punish Ireland across the full 80 minutes?
Scotland, they're so frustrating, really, aren't they? I mean, it's one step forward, two steps back. I mean, defensively, they were the outstanding team in the Six Nations for the last 2 years. I think, was it 5 tries conceded in 2020? No, they had 10 last year, but still, that was the lowest in the championship. They've conceded 11 already in 4 games. Italy scored 3 tries against them last year, which is almost as if they look to move their game on from just being a defensive team and then have lost their concentration in that. I still like their front 5 is competent, but it's not a sort of destroying front 5 the likes of what France have or what England potentially have. Now, and I suppose from an attacking perspective, when you look at it, Scotland had 5 players on the Lions tour who featured in the Test series. You had Ali Price and Finn Russell came on in the 3rd Test. You had Harris in the centre, who's a very good player, in my opinion, got 2 tries against Italy at the weekend. Duan van der Merwe and Hogg at full back. The difference for Scotland in this year's championship, I think, 3 of those players, Russell hasn't been as influential as you thought he might have been. Hogg has been hot and cold. And Ali Price, prior to last Saturday, for someone who had sort of got the Test place ahead of Conor Murray in South Africa, had been quite poor. Now, he was back to his best last weekend. So for Scotland, it's a question of getting their balance right. Just when they seem to find one area where they're dominant and where they're stressing teams, there's another area that appears to let them down. So look, I think Scotland have a psychological barrier with Ireland as well. If you look at all we're the one team that Gregor Townsend hasn't managed to beat. He's in the Scotland job now, I think 4 or 5 years at this stage, but he's never beaten Ireland in the Six Nations. So from that point of view, you go back to the World Cup, Yokohama, Scotland were the big threat to us early on, and Ireland dealt with them far more comfortably than they did with Japan, for example, in that pool stage. So, look, I think Ireland will be disappointed with aspects of their performance last week. They have a lot to play for this weekend. I think Scotland are under more pressure. Does that make them more dangerous? I think from an attacking perspective, they may be getting back to where they were, so there will be a threat. But again, defensively, Ireland were outstanding. I mean, England didn't score a try at the weekend.
Is it something with Scotland, though, that they have a habit, particularly in the last 12 months or so, of playing up and down to the opposition? Like they've beaten England 2 years in a row in the Six Nations. They beat France last year in the Six Nations. And then they've had games like round 2 against Wales this year when they really should be winning that game and they just completely left it behind. Sloppiness against Italy just gone as well. So they have a habit of producing these big one-off performances when they want to.
Absolutely. I think it's very frustrating for Gregor because obviously a poor World Cup, he thought he'd solved it by giving him that, defensive mentality and defensive steel, and some of their stats defensively were the best in the world for a while. But now it's just gone. He just can't get results, to back. And I think they are dangerous because they come to Aviva with nothing to lose and they have the ability to score from long range. The rumor is that Blair Kinghorn is going to start and Finn Russell is dropped, which would be interesting. But look at I don't know where they're going. On paper they're better than they were, but yes, bar the England game, there's not evidence of that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. In terms of selection, Ireland will be naming their team tomorrow. We know for certain anyway there's going to be one change. James Ryan isn't going to be involved after his head injury against England. On the theme of that, guys, like it's still coming into stark focus again. I think in general, pretty much everyone is in agreement that red card was a red card. There hasn't been much debate around it whatsoever. But like we're several years now into this clampdown by World Rugby and officials on, head equals red. That message has been clear now for quite a few years. But are behaviours changing at all, Bernard, particularly when it comes to coaching? Are coaches encouraging players to tackle low, or is there still a focus on, trying to cover the ball in that contact area when you're making a tackle on someone?
I think that the pressure now needs to go back to coaches and players. I heard Sam Warburton talk on Friday night about the lack of improvement in tackle tech, and it's a shared responsibility from coaches and players. So coaches who are working with these players day in, day out, they need to change the behaviours, and we haven't seen a significant enough shift. Having said that, 29 players who played in Twickenham had their tackle technique right. You know what I mean? So we can't get carried away or get over excited about the one player every second game or third game who makes a mistake. But I do think that has to be the next focus. And I'm sure World Rugby are working actively at that, about trying to coach the coaches better, and obviously that transferring then to players at all levels. But the tackle height has to drop in general. I mean, there's too many head collisions in my opinion.
I've seen some people in the last couple of days as well suggesting that even maybe the language around rugby probably needs to change, like kind of referencing the fact that Eddie Jones, for example, spent all of last week talking about the importance of physicality and, really getting in the faces of players and things like that. And, is there a link between a week's worth of conversation around that and psyching up players, and 82 seconds into a game where Charlie Ewels just runs upright into someone just because I imagine he's so focused on, it's been ingrained in him for a week or 2 weeks. I have to make a hit. I need to put my stamp on this game early on.
Yeah, look, I think that a lot of people seem to be focused on...
By the way, it's not it's not throwing Eddie Jones under the bus. Pretty much every coach says these things week on week,
Well, look, you can't get away from the fact that rugby is a physical contact game. I mean, we all talk about winning the gain line, controlling the collisions. Who wins the collisions wins the game. That is the way rugby is played. The advent of professionalism has meant that the players are getting bigger, stronger, faster. So it's inevitable that there is going to be a fallout somewhere. That fallout has come in terms of the worrying concerns around concussion. So therefore, I think those who run the game, there is an onus on them to protect the players from themselves. And that the tackle one is the one that's taking the most time to adjust. I mean, I know I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, but look at the amount of bombs that England put up against Ireland. Hugo Keenan was absolutely outstanding in the air. But look at the contest. The hang time that Smith put on those was incredible. Yet, there wasn't one England player like Jack Nowell and, say, Freddie Stewart. They were the two guys who were putting the pressure on Hugo Keenan. But there was not one incident where they felt that they were going to challenge in the air because they knew Keenan had commanded that space. He was up in the air before them. You go back 2 or 3 years ago, you would have seen a player arrive late, even though he didn't have a chance of winning the ball. Then you'd have a collision in the air and somebody come down and land on their back or their neck, and you had a serious issue. And that normally led to a red card. You don't see that anymore. Why? Because players have learned that the consequence of competing when you don't have a chance could be very costly. So they wait until you come down to ground. And to be fair, England did that brilliantly. They forced 1 or 2 penalties from Keenan because he didn't release once he came back onto ground. The tip tackle one. We don't see that in the game anymore. I know we had Alex Kendall, and there was an issue, a ridiculous one.
At least there was no debate around that one whatsoever.
Well, geez, I don't know what Duplessis was thinking in his head, but Alex Kendall, I mean, when you talk about being dropped from a height, I mean, it was ridiculous. But anyway, that's a debate for another day. But by and large, you don't see those things anymore. Look, you have to put pressure on the opposition. That involves trying to, like, you see stats that come out. You're talking about, it isn't tackles anymore. It's how many dominant tackles do you have? I think we just have to stick with it. I think by the time you get to the next World Cup, like, coaches and players have to see, by and large, when you get a player sent off, it means you don't have a chance of winning the game. So therefore, the behaviours have to change. Like, when there's a duty of care to somebody like James Ryan, I think he's an outstanding player. And it would be awful if you thought that he was forced out of the game because of a sequence of tackles over a period of a year or 2 years. That could have a long-term consequence for him.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, Bernard, Is there any sign that behaviours are changing? Are we seeing less of these tackles than we did a couple of years ago?
I actually think we're definitely not seeing more of them. I just think that the awareness and the technology and the focus from a refereeing group, so not just the referee, the touch judges, but more importantly, the TMO, more of them are getting looked at again. And like, in fairness, some of them, you know, there was the Ryan Baird one, you know, in Italy that I didn't notice live. In actual fact, the red card against the Italian hooker, I didn't notice that live as well as being a red card, but when you see it played back. So I think that there hasn't been any more incidents. Maybe there's even less, but the whole focus point means that much more of them are getting picked up and looked at. And once you go through that set of protocols, you know, it's more likely than not that it's going to end up in a red unless there's really clear mitigating circumstances.
Is it a step in the right direction? Personally, I felt that I saw very, very little dissent against a red card on Saturday. And I do think that maybe 12, 18 months ago, there probably would have been more, like a handful more pundits or a handful more supporters saying, no, yellow is enough there. You know, it's a contact sport, it's a rugby collision, etc. Is that a step in the right direction? That, like, there certainly seemed to be a greater consensus that absolutely was a red card.
Yeah, I think people's expectation levels and understanding of how important it is that we fix this have improved massively, and that's the first point. I mean, Donal said that they didn't show it on the big screen, so hence the people in the stadium felt it might be a mistake. But I think if they had seen it as well, they would have understood it more. So I suppose is that from a safety point of view, or is that from a point of view about James Ryan's family and they don't want to show it? I'm not sure why they didn't show it back in the big screen. But
people talk about intent. Intent doesn't come into it. It's not a factor in a collision like that. I mean, nobody, 9 times out of 10, it wasn't like the old days when fellas went out trying to take your head off. Nobody goes out to deliberately do damage. No doubt in my mind, Charlie Ewels, the issue for him is he's 6'7". He's got to learn how to drop his body height. But I think what is the issue in terms of the crowd being let into the conversation that 8 million people are listening to at home? And I think, there would be a far greater acceptance for the decision. It probably worked in England's favour in that the crowd were so incensed by it that they got so much behind the team. It definitely gave England a lift from that point of view. But look, the referee, spot on, conversation with the TMO, 100% correct, and that's what you want.
Yeah, certainly. I don't think there was any debate anyway about that. Before we finish up, guys, obviously the other game that the Irish fans will be interested in will be 8 o'clock in Paris on Saturday night, and France taking on England. We obviously need France to slip up and hope that Ireland win as well against Scotland in order to win the title. Bernard, you were in Cardiff on Friday night for Wales against France, and like, it is a team with France over the last year or so that is as good as they've been and as brilliant rugby they play and the results they've had, that there have been plenty of occasions in the last 12 months where in tight games in the last 10-15 minutes they've been quite jittery, and on some occasions they've come through. But you look at Scotland last year, they didn't. There were games against Australia over the summer as well when it came right down to the wire and they got quite nervy as well and lost them. So they aren't these stone cold killing machines. No,
they're definitely not infallible, and I think England will see areas of that game, particularly how Wales dominated the kick battle, how they found grass, and how they were able to snuff out them defensively as well. Even though I thought France had to beaten them a few times, just passing accuracy wasn't as good as it normally is. But you have to understand the mindset of the French. I mean, they will not see the flaws in that performance. They'll see the positives. And I actually think that they kept a reasonably high level of composure. At the end, the defence was rock solid. Wales, bar that crossfield kick to Faletau that he topped back inside to John Davies, didn't really look like they had him stretched. And it was a real Sean Edwards type performance. So they're going back to Stade de France. They've gone away to Wales. They've gone away to Scotland and got the job done. So they're 80 minutes away from a Grand Slam, 200k bonus each, which is a nice dessert on top of a trophy for them. And I think, look, at the atmosphere is going to be phenomenal. 9 o'clock kickoff local time. As Donal said, we've both been over there this year. The connection between the public now and this team is phenomenal, and I think they're going to be new men. I mean, they'll be back to their best. Now, obviously, England have the power to take them on or match them at set piece time, but geez, I think they're in a pretty good place. And Mofana played in the wing. He's a phenomenal rugby player. I think he's a centre. I mean, he had a couple of chances that if Penno was fit, Wales wouldn't have recovered, but he's out this weekend. I think Penno's back. Taufania's back. They went 5-3 on the bench. They'll go 6-2. Look, obviously there's a chance, but I think France will finish in style.
What about you, Donal?
Yeah, I agree with that. You talked about the mental challenge and the fact that they were stressed and put under pressure. International rugby isn't all about just being flash and scoring great tries and all that type of thing. I mean, France have that. They have more X-factor players probably than anybody else in the championship. But there's times when you just got to get down and dirty and get stuck in and defend. So from that point of view, I think a bit like Ireland and Twickenham, I think Friday night's game in Cardiff is a huge learning curve for this French team. Like their average, I think they're about 450 caps in their match day squad. Ireland are up over 700 or 800. So, I mean, people still have to appreciate this is a young, developing French team. And when you talk about being stressed and having to come through games, for me, there's 3 games this season alone that the France of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years ago would have lost. One against New Zealand. The week after we beat New Zealand, France were well on top of that game for a long period of time. New Zealand brought them back to 3 points, I think. And you remember you had that Ntamack break from behind his own goal line when they ended up scoring at the other end. That was a game that France would have lost before. The Ireland game, the fact that Ireland, they were so far ahead of Ireland for a period. Ireland came back and closed it out at the end. They hung in and they won that game. And they did it again on the road. And that was the significant difference this time. Those 2 other games were in the Stade de France. This was in Cardiff. And even Cardiff is probably the best stadium in the world. When you get, and I know it wasn't full the other night, and that's a debate maybe for another day, 12,000 people missing. But you could see this young French team, even at the anthems, they were kind of looking around and they were taking it all in. So for them to come out of that test and win it, I think is hugely significant. I think Saturday night, when you consider, what are we now? We're 19 months away from a World Cup final. In terms of a dress rehearsal, and Sean Edwards has been talking about this, we're not a great team until we win something. France haven't won anything for a long, long time. They haven't won the championship in 12 years. They haven't won a Grand Slam in 12 years. The pressure is on them now to perform on Saturday night against England, of all people. Of all the teams they want to beat, it's England. So I think it'll be a huge test of this team, but I think they've passed every test that has come their way so far. I agree with Birch. I think they'll win. I think England had their chances against Ireland. From an attacking perspective, England are struggling to score tries. France will score tries. So on that basis alone, I think they'll win. I'd love to be sitting back, Ireland with the Triple Crown in the bag, find a nice quiet pub somewhere, have a pint and watch the game. I'm sure it'll be a cracker, but I think the Grand Slam, I felt France were going to win the championship all year. The Grand Slam was debatable. Winning 5 games in a row in this championship is difficult, but I think they're good enough to win it.
All right. Well, we'll see how it goes this Saturday. Donal and Birch, thanks for joining us. Plenty of rugby coming up this Saturday across RTÉ Radio and RTÉ TV. On Saturday afternoon, 4:45 kickoff, Ireland against Scotland at the Aviva Stadium. That's live on RTÉ Radio 1. And on RTÉ 2 and the RTÉ Player, you can see Wales against Italy from 2:15. You can also see France against England at 8 o'clock. And we'll be starting the day down in South Africa as well with the Lions against Munster at Ellis Park in the United Rugby Championship. That game kicking off at 12 in the afternoon. But from us here on the RTÉ Rugby Podcast, we'll be back again next week. We'll see you then.
The RTÉ Rugby Podcast, sponsored by Canterbury. See the new Irish men and women's rugby jerseys at canterbury.com.